The heavy crystal decanter shattered against the oak floor, amber liquid soaking into the hem of Minho's tailored trousers, but he didn't feel the sting of the glass shards. His eyes were locked on the small, crumpled slip of paper he'd fished from the lining of his father's funeral suit, a suit that had been dry-cleaned by the only maid allowed in the East Wing. In a jagged, frantic hand, the ink bled into the fibers. He didn't die from the heart attack. Look under the floorboards in the library. They're coming for me next. Outside the study, the soft, rhythmic scuff of a mop ceased. The silence that followed was heavy, pressurized. Minho gripped the edge of his mahogany desk, his knuckles turning a ghostly white, as the shadow of a woman paused beneath the gap of the door. 7 hours ago, Minho was the undisputed king of the Kang Corporation, a man who measured life in quarterly dividends and ice-cold board meetings. Now the air in his own mansion tasted like copper and old dust. The maid, Hannah, a girl who had never raised her eyes above his tie, had just handed him a death sentence wrapped in a plea for help. To understand how a billionaire found himself gripping a fireplace poker in a darkened hallway, you have to see the rot hidden behind the gold leaf molding. Every loyalty Minho ever held was about to be incinerated. He moved to the door, his leather soles making no sound on the silk Persian rug. He yanked the handle. Hannah stood there, her hands knotted in her white apron, her breath hitching in a series of shallow, jagged gasps. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She stared at the paper in his hand, her knees buckling until she hit the floor. Minho reached down, his fingers locking around her upper arm, not to strike but to hoist her into the room. He slammed the door and turned the deadbolt. Who else saw this? Minho's voice was a low, vibrating rasp. Hannah's lip trembled, a single drop of crimson appearing where her teeth bit deep. She shook her head, her gaze darting to the vents in the ceiling. She grabbed a pen from his desk and scrawled on the back of an invoice, "The house has ears. Don't speak." She pointed toward the library, her fingers shaking like a leaf in a gale. Minho felt a cold sweat prickle at his hairline. His father's estate wasn't a sanctuary, it was a panopticon. He grabbed his heavy wool coat and tossed it to her. "We're leaving." Hannah didn't move. She pointed to the security camera in the corner, its red eye pulsing like a steady heartbeat. She mimed a throat-slitting motion. The first complication had arrived. The security team downstairs didn't report to him, they reported to his uncle, the man currently sitting in the library, the man who had delivered the eulogy. Minho realized then that the note wasn't just information, it was a timer. He crossed to the wall safe, his fingers blurring through the combination. He didn't grab the cash, he grabbed the snub-nosed revolver his father had kept for emergencies. He tucked it into the small of his back, the cold metal biting into his skin. He looked at Hannah, whose eyes were wide, reflecting the flickering computer monitors. The library. Now. They slipped into the service corridor, a narrow artery of shadows behind the velvet-clad walls of the mansion. The air in the library smelled of old paper and expensive tobacco. His uncle, Junji, sat in a wingback chair, the smoke from his cigar curling into the rafters. He didn't look up when the hidden door creaked. "You always did have a penchant for the dramatic, Minho," Junji said, his voice smooth as polished stone. Minho didn't answer. He stepped over to the section of the floor Hannah had indicated, his boot tapping the wood. It sounded hollow. He ignored the man in the chair and knelt, his fingernails digging into the grooves of the oak. He pried. The wood groaned, snapping a hidden latch, and the floorboard came free. Beneath the dust lay a leather-bound ledger and a small glass vial, empty but for a faint, milky residue. Minho's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He looked at the vial, then at his uncle. Junji finally stood, the cigar glowing a menacing orange. "Some secrets are buried for a reason, nephew. Your father understood the price of an empire. Do you?" Behind Minho, the library doors thudded shut. 3 men in dark suits stepped from the shadows, their hands resting on the hilts of their knives. Minho realized he hadn't just found a note, he'd walked into an execution chamber. The lead henchman didn't wait for a command. He lunged, the blade of his switchblade catching the dim light in a silver arc. Minho spun, the heavy floorboard still in his grip, and swung with a desperate, uncoordinated strength. The wood connected with the man's temple with a sickening thud, sending him reeling into a globe that shattered into 1,000 plastic continents. Hannah didn't cower. She grabbed a heavy brass bookend and hurled it at the second man, the metal striking him square in the chest. "The ledger, Minho." Hannah screamed, her voice breaking the silence she had kept for months. He grabbed the book and the vial, shoving them into the inner pocket of his coat. They scrambled toward the spiral staircase, the only exit not blocked by Junji's men. Junji didn't move, he simply watched, his face a mask of bored indifference. You won't make it to the gate, he called out as they ascended. The world already thinks you're grieving. A tragic accident wouldn't surprise anyone. They reached the second-floor gallery, the sound of boots pounding the stairs behind them. Minho grabbed a heavy mahogany table and shoved it over the railing, a makeshift barricade that sent the pursuers scrambling. He looked at Hannah, her face pale, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. The garage is blocked, he hissed. We go to the roof. He led her through the labyrinth of the upper guest rooms, his mind racing through the schematics of the house. He knew every crawlspace, every vent. He'd designed the security upgrades last year. He punched a code into a hidden panel behind a painting of a hunting scene. A narrow door hummed open, revealing the maintenance ladder to the roof. He shoved Hannah up first, his hands shaking as he followed. The cool night air hit them, a sharp contrast to the suffocating heat of the mansion. The Seoul skyline glittered in the distance, a million lights that felt like a million miles away. Below them, the floodlights of the estate flickered on, bathing the lawn in a sterile, white glare. There. Hannah pointed to the helipad. Minho's personal pilot was always on standby, but as they sprinted across the gravel, the rotors didn't move. The pilot sat in the cockpit, his head slumped against the glass, a dark stain spreading across the seat. Minho skidded to a halt, his heels kicking up dust. They were trapped on a literal island in the sky. He looked at the ledge, then at the ledger in his pocket. If this book didn't leave the grounds, his father's murder would be just another footnote in the Kang legacy. He pulled the revolver from his waistband. He wasn't a marksman, but the weight of the steel gave his hands a temporary, artificial steadiness. The roof door burst open. Junji stepped out, flanked by the remaining guards. He wasn't carrying a gun, he was carrying a tablet. He tapped the screen. The estate's perimeter sirens began to wail, a deafening, discordant shriek that tore through the night. The police are already on their way, Minho. I reported a domestic disturbance. A distraught nephew attacking his staff. They'll find the gun in your hand and the girl's body. It's a very clean story. Hannah stepped forward, her hands raised. He's lying, Minho. Look at the ledger. Page 42. Minho flipped the book open with one hand, his thumb catching on a page stained with a thumbprint of blood. It wasn't a list of assets. It was a list of names, politicians, judges, the very police force currently racing toward the gates. His father hadn't been murdered over money. He'd been murdered because he was about to blow the whistle on a syndicate that owned the city. If you believe that the truth is worth more than $1 billion empire, hit the like button so this story reaches the people who can change the world. Minho looked at the tablet in his uncle's hand. You're not just the killer, Junji. You're the middleman. Junji smiled, a thin, jagged line. I'm the survivor. Now give me the book. He gestured to the guards. They stepped forward, their shadows stretching long across the gravel. Minho didn't aim at the guards. He aimed at the fuel tank of the helicopter. If I go down, the evidence goes with me. Minho yelled over the sirens. The guards froze. A single spark would turn the roof into a funeral pyre. Junji's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing. You're too much of a coward to die for a maid, Minho. Minho felt Hannah's hand catch his own. Her grip was firm, her skin warm against his cold palms. She didn't look at the guards, she looked at the ledger. He's right, Hannah whispered. Don't die for me. Live for the truth. She lunged, not at Junji but at the tablet. She caught him off guard, her small frame colliding with his chest. The tablet flew from his hand, skidding toward the edge of the roof. Junji let out a guttural roar, his fingers clawing at her hair. Minho didn't hesitate. He didn't fire at the helicopter. He fired at the base of the communication tower. The tower creaked, the metal groaning as it buckled under the weight of its own dish. It collapsed across the roof door, sealing the guards inside the stairwell. Minho grabbed Hannah, pulling her back from the ledge as Junji scrambled for the tablet. The screen was shattered, but the upload bar was still visible. He had been streaming the entire confrontation to a cloud server. Hannah hadn't been trying to destroy it, she'd been trying to ensure it finished. The blue and red lights of the police cruisers began to weave up the long driveway, their sirens a mournful howl in the valley. Junji stood up, clutching the broken tablet, his face pale in the strobe light flicker. It doesn't matter, he spat, his voice cracking. I have the best lawyers in the country. That video proves nothing but a struggle. Minho reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He hadn't been recording video. He had been on a live conference call with the board of directors since he walked into the library. They heard everything, Uncle. The ledger, the vial, the clean story, about the maid. Minho's voice was cold, final. The sirens grew louder, the first officers spilling out onto the lawn below. The guards behind the collapsed tower were shouting, their boots thudding against the metal door, but they were trapped. Junji looked at the ledge, then at the men below. He realized then that the empire had already fallen. He didn't run. He sat down on the gravel, the cigar long extinguished. Your father was a fool, Minho. He thought he could be a saint in a city of sinners. Minho stood over him, the revolver heavy in his hand. He wasn't a saint. He was just a man who was tired of lying. He turned to Hannah. She was leaning against the wreckage of the communication tower, her white apron stained with soot, her hair a wild tangle. Are you okay? Minho asked, his voice softening for the first time. She didn't answer with words. She reached out and took the empty vial from his pocket, holding it up to the light. I've been working in this house for 3 years, Mr. Kang. I didn't write that note because I wanted your money. I wrote it because your father was the only person who ever saw me as a person. The police burst onto the roof through the secondary elevator, their weapons drawn. Minho dropped the revolver, his hands raised. He didn't look at the officers. He looked at the ledger lying on the gravel. One of the detectives, a man with a face like etched granite, picked it up. He looked at Junji, then at Minho. Mr. Kang. We have some questions about your uncle's involvement in a certain pharmaceutical shipment. The next 3 hours were a blur of flashbulbs, sterile interrogation rooms, and the smell of bad coffee. Minho sat in the precinct, his coat draped over his shoulders, watching the news ticker at the bottom of the television screen. Kang Corporation CEO arrested in murder plot. The world was tearing itself apart over the contents of a maid's note. Hannah sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a paper cup. The police had cleared her, but she looked like a ghost. What will you do now? She asked. Minho looked at the bruises on his knuckles. He thought about the boardrooms, the gold leaf molding, and the empty vial. I'm selling the estate. Every brick of it. He leaned forward. And I want to set up a foundation. In my father's name. For people like you. People the world tries to make invisible. Hannah smiled, a small, fragile thing that didn't quite reach her eyes. I don't want to be a foundation, Mr. Kang. I just want to go home. Minho stood up, his joints popping. He realized then that the victory wasn't in the arrest or the ledger. It was in the fact that for the first time in his life, he didn't have to look at a shadow and wonder if it was an enemy. If you believe that the quietest people often carry the loudest truths, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story matters. He walked her to the doors of the precinct. The morning sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the streets in shades of pale pink and gold. A taxi was waiting at the curb. Minho reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver key. This is to a safe deposit box at the central bank. It's not money. It's the deeds to my father's private villa in Jeju. He wanted to give it to someone he trusted. I think he meant you. Hannah stared at the key, her fingers trembling as she took it. I can't take this. Minho closed her hand over the metal. You saved my life, Hannah. And more importantly, you saved my soul. The villa is yours. Go there. Watch the ocean. Forget this house ever existed. He watched her get into the taxi, the small car merging into the morning traffic until it was gone. He stood on the sidewalk, a billionaire with a ruined suit and a broken family. He felt a weight lift from his chest, a physical sensation like a bird taking flight. He started walking, not toward his office and not toward the mansion. He just walked. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in 30 years, he wasn't afraid to find out. The Kang Corporation would survive, but it would be different. It would be different. He thought about the note, the crumpled slip of paper that had started it all. He still had it in his pocket. He pulled it out and watched it catch the wind, a small white speck dancing between the skyscrapers before it vanished into the light. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about people who risked everything for the truth. The city was waking up, a cacophony of horns and distant sirens. Minho stopped at a small coffee cart, the steam rising in the cool air. He bought 2 cups and gave one to the man sleeping on the bench nearby. He didn't say a word. He just nodded and kept walking. The note was gone, the secret was out, and the king had stepped down from his throne. He looked up at the sky, the blue deepening as the sun rose higher. He wasn't the boss anymore. He wasn't an heir. He was just a man. And as the crowds began to fill the sidewalks, he realized that being a man was finally enough. The floorboards had been ripped up, the rot had been exposed, and the morning was finally clear. The story didn't end with a wedding or a victory parade. It ended with a quiet walk through a city that no longer felt like a cage. Minho Kang took a deep breath, the air cold and fresh, and smiled. The maid's note hadn't just exposed a murder, it had opened a door. And he was finally ready to walk through it. The secret was safe because it was no longer a secret. It was a legacy. And as he turned the corner, disappearing into the sea of people, the world kept turning, oblivious to the fact that it had just been saved by a crumpled piece of paper and a girl who refused to stay silent. The silence of the Jeju coastline was a lie. Hannah stood on the balcony of the villa, the silver key heavy in her pocket, watching the tide retreat over the jagged black rocks. She had been there for 3 days, but the smell of the mansion, the scent of lemon wax and high-stakes rot, still clung to the back of her throat. She reached for the railing, her fingers brushing a small metallic protrusion hidden under the wood. It was a transmitter, its red light blinking with a rhythmic, predatory pulse. The clean story Minho's uncle had tried to spin wasn't dead, it had just migrated. Back in Seoul, Minho sat in a sterile glass interrogation room, but he wasn't the one being questioned. He was watching through a one-way mirror as a forensic accountant highlighted a series of wire transfers in the ledger. The money hadn't stopped at his uncle. The trail led to a shell company in Panama, one owned by the very foundation his father had purportedly set up to protect the invisible. Every charitable cent had been a bribe. Minho felt the bile rise. He leaned into the microphone, his voice cutting through the speaker in the other room. Follow the transfers from October 14th. That's the day the maid was hired. The detective turned, his face a map of grim realization. October 14th wasn't a hire date, Mr. Kang. It was a purchase date. Minho's phone buzzed in his pocket, a restricted number. He answered, the sound of the ocean roaring in the background of the call. She's not a maid, Minho, a distorted voice whispered. She's the insurance policy. And you just gave her the keys to the vault. Minho's heart skipped a beat as he watched the screen in the interrogation room reveal a photo of Hannah from 10 years ago, standing next to his father in a laboratory, not a kitchen. Hannah heard the gravel crunch behind her. She didn't turn around. She knew the gait of the man approaching. It was heavy, deliberate, the step of someone who owned the ground he walked on. You took your time, Director Park, she said, her voice devoid of the tremor she had used in the mansion. The man who stepped into the light wasn't a henchman. He was the chief of police. The ledger was a decoy, wasn't it? He asked, his hand resting on the hilt of a silenced pistol. Hannah finally turned, her eyes cold and sharp as the sea glass at her feet. The ledger was the distraction. The villa is the destination. She reached into the pocket of her apron, the same one she'd worn during the escape, and pulled out a small glass vial. It wasn't empty. It was filled with a shimmering, iridescent liquid. My father didn't die for a corporate secret, she said, her voice a low, vibrating command. He died to hide the fact that the Kang legacy isn't built on tech. It's built on the blood of the children you experimented on in the East Wing. I'm the only one left, Park. And I'm not a maid anymore. She uncapped the vial and held it over the balcony, the wind catching the scent of something metallic and ancient. If you believe that the people the world tries to make invisible are actually the ones holding all the power, hit the like button so Hannah's real story finally gets told. Park raised the gun, but his hand was shaking. The ground beneath the villa began to hum, a low-frequency vibration that made the glass doors chatter in their frames. Minho's voice suddenly erupted from the villa's outdoor speakers, patched in from the precinct. Park, don't move. The vial isn't a chemical. It's a biometric trigger. Minho was staring at a secondary screen in Seoul, watching a satellite map of Jeju. The villa wasn't a home, it was the lid of a silo. Underneath the gardens where his father had promised peace, a massive server farm was whirring to life, fueled by the liquid in Hannah's hand. The invisible ones are tired of watching, Park, Hannah whispered. She poured the liquid into the transmitter on the railing. The red light turned a blinding, steady white. Across Seoul, every screen in the Kang Corporation, every police terminal and every news monitor flickered. The invisible history of the city, the names of the lost, the records of the experiments, the faces of the children, began to scroll in an unbreakable loop. The vault didn't hold money, it held the truth, and Hannah had just pulled the plug. Park fell to his knees as the sirens began to wail in the distance. This time, they weren't coming for the maid. Minho watched the data flood the world, his father's face appearing on the screen one last time, followed by a list of every co-conspirator in the city. He realized then that the note in the suit hadn't been a plea for help, it had been a recruitment. Hannah looked out at the ocean, the weight of 10 years finally sliding off her shoulders. She wasn't a victim and she wasn't a survivor. She was the architect of the end.